get started with the show, we wanted to draw listeners' attention to our Patreon page. If you've been enjoying the show and taking any value from it whatsoever, please consider supporting us there.
If you sign up for our crowdfunding platform on Patreon, you can get a great selection of rewards, notably a collection of successful magazine pitches from Rachel, myself, and other co-hosts and friends of the show. And we'd also like to give a shout out to one of our most recent patrons, who is Rhys Thomas. Rachel, can you tell us a bit about Rhys?
I can. Rhys is a men's advice columnist for Vice UK, but he started freelancing full-time back in January, so he's looking to connect with editors and to find some new writing opportunities. We hope that some of the advice in this episode will be useful to you, Rhys, and thank you very much for supporting the show.
Thank you very much, Rhys. Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and myself spoke with the magazine writer Samanth Subramanian.
We spoke to Samanth about studying journalism as an undergraduate, about transitioning to narrative journalism, and about the grueling realities of freelance journalism.
It's a great and really candid episode, and we hope you enjoy it.
Hello, Samanth, and welcome to Always Take Notes. It's great to have you on the show. To kick us off, could you tell us a little bit about when you realised you wanted to do journalism? Because you studied it at university, which is quite unusual for guests on the show.
Yes, I did an undergraduate degree in the US in journalism, and this was at a time when I still didn't know what I wanted to do exactly. And so when you apply to American universities, you're expected to put down a major up front with the understanding that you can always change it if you want to halfway through your degree. And so I put down journalism as a placeholder when I applied to Penn State. And then I went there and I took a couple of classes in it. And I realized I quite enjoyed it because it spoke to a lot of interests that I already had, reading and writing and the news. And so I decided I would just forge on and see how that would play out. And so that was when I guess I decided to be a journalist in the proper sense of the word, maybe halfway through university when I figured I'd stick with my major.
And did you also study business logistics? I was just looking at your LinkedIn earlier and it said journalism and business logistics, which seemed an esoteric combination.
Yeah, journalism was and maybe still is the kind of career where you always feel like maybe a backup would be useful. Maybe 2, sometimes 3. And so I had a minor in business logistics, which I did at university. At some point, a couple of years after I started being a journalist, I contemplated giving it all up and doing an MBA. My master's was in international affairs, which again was the kind of wide open field that might allow you to come back into journalism, but might also allow you entry into the World Bank, for example. And so it always felt, it's not until the last few years that I've felt confident enough about the career itself. It always felt as if it was going to be a precarious position and that eventually I'm going to have to go back and do something else for a living.
Well, I'm glad that the policy hasn't beckoned you just yet. When you were studying journalism, what was the sort of structure of that course?
It was kind of interesting because I went in there thinking surely writing is not something you're able to teach at a university level. Either you're a critical reader and therefore a diligent sponge of writing lessons from things that you read, or you're not. But it turned out that I actually learned a hell of a lot. And so a lot of the modules were quite basic. We literally revisited punctuation and grammar in one semester-long course. We talked about structure. We talked about how to read. We did one module, I believe, where we started writing an assignment sort of early in the semester and then just revised that again through the course of the next 12 or 13 weeks. And I realized that the value of that came not so much in terms of how it fed one's creativity, but in terms of allowing you to do a lot of things almost on autopilot, which includes, paying attention to structure and outlining and grammar and so on, so that you don't have to think about those things when you actually have to sit down to write. You can think about the really creative aspects of of the writing process, which is putting the words down on paper and telling a story in an interesting way.
And just to clarify for our listeners as much as anything, so you were doing this was an undergraduate degree in journalism, because we've had a lot of
4
people
years.
who've done postgraduate degrees, but how did doing it at an undergraduate level differ, do you think, to the 1 year postgrad masters that lots of people do?
The one huge advantage was, I don't know how, I think maybe you needed like 120 credits to graduate, out of which 60 of those had to be in non-journalism courses. And they could be from practically anywhere in the university. And so you could take, as I did, some business logistics courses, but you could also take, as I did, Greek history, art history. I skied for a 1.5 credit course for the course for a winter semester. So this was all, it was such a broad education, and that was a complete change from what I experienced growing up in school, which is in India, where I'm from, school education tends to be quite narrow and tends to narrow down further as you grow older. And so it opened up all these doors for me in terms of just learning about things. And so I got the kind of broad-based education that I think I'm reaping the benefits of now, as in a way, as a magazine journalist, because I tend to write about things that are quite different from assignment to assignment.
And when you did your master's in international relations, were you sort of working freelance on the side, or did you do that after you left?
Well, I mean, I was doing sort of, I did a few pieces here and there for newspapers back home. This is when I was living in New York. Back home was for a couple of papers in India, but it wasn't much. I mean, I was there, the master's was quite a busy degree in that sense. And so I would write a few book reviews and so on, but I wasn't really freelancing. I really only properly began to freelance in 2011, and I've been doing it now for about 9 years.
Could we talk about some of your early steps in journalism? Is it correct that a lot of your early reporting was about cricket?
That's right. So late in my university degree, in my journalism degree, I was quite fixated on the idea of becoming a cricket journalist. And so I got out of university and I did that for 2.5 years, I believe, before realizing that maybe I wanted to write about other things as well.
Was it that it was a bit of a slow pace, or was it, that's not a crap pun. Was it just, what made you abandon your dream of being a cricket journalist?
Oh, I mean, I started sort of, I guess, reading more widely, and I realized that I was interested in writing about other things. And cricket is a sport I dearly love, and so also doing it for, following it for a living tended to erode my love for it in some sense. And so I was reading, at the time I was sort of a big film buff. I still am, but I was reading a lot of books on film, and I decided maybe I wanted to write about film. So I did a little freelance movie reviewing for a while. I would write about books because I read books a lot. And, gradually my operating thesis for my career seemed to be that, okay, you have a small, limited set of tools, which includes sort of the ability to research and then analyze and then write in particular ways. But the biggest thing you can do with this limited set of tools is to apply it to as many different subjects as possible. And so that tends to be it's sort of a very workmanlike approach to journalism, I think, but it's something that I still pursue now.
And you did stints at Mint and then also at the National in Abu Dhabi. Could you tell us about both what those publications are for people who might not be familiar with them and the kind of work you were doing there?
Sure. So Mint was a business newspaper that was launched in India in 2007. It was a collaboration between the Wall Street Journal and an Indian daily called the Hindustan Times. It was a very exciting product for its time. It was sort of a tabloid format, not at all stodgy business journalism in the way that we used to think of business journalism, but there were sort of quite cutting edge features, a great weekend supplement. And so I eventually became sort of the guy who would write a lot of A-heads, as they call them, at the Wall Street Journal. This is the story that starts on the front page, but then spills over onto maybe an entire page of the inside. And so this was my way of doing features across a number of subjects. So I would write about, I'm just trying to sort of think off the top of my head, the manufacture of musical instruments. I would write about the valuation of art, things like that. And so it allowed me this entree into a number of different beats without necessarily being pinned down to any of them. And then I quit that in late 2010, and I started doing this job at the National, which was working as the India correspondent for the National. But what that also meant was, due to the contract that I had with them, I was free to pursue as much freelancing as I wanted on the side. I was writing a book. And so it was really sort of a way to keep these three aspects of my life in play, a job, and then magazine pieces, and then the book itself.
And in terms of, you've mentioned that your interests are very wide ranging. In terms of how you find ideas, is there a particular sort of method you use? Do you devote time in your week to looking for things, or is it just sort of stumbling across things that interest you?
Well, a lot of it involves reading relatively brief things that appear daily in newspapers and magazines and on the internet, and kind of wondering at the larger, bigger story behind them, or trying to think of larger themes out there in the world that might be addressed in interesting ways. Very often, now it's gotten to the point where, maybe 40% of the pieces that I do are ideas that are given to me by my various editors, and then 60% are self-generated. And so so that tends to vary, but quite often it does. This is really the crux of it, is that you read small, interesting things, whether it's in newsletters or in Reddit forums or on news websites, and you sense there may be something bigger there. So it's sort of an intuitive skill that you try to hone, I guess, and it doesn't often work out. Very often I'll do sort of a lot of basic research on a story and then realize it's going nowhere. But it pays off often enough that you can make a living out of it. And then, of course, there's a lot of, particularly this year in 2020, there's been a lot of pieces that are just out there for the taking. Early in the pandemic, for instance, when people were still in the early stages of a lockdown around the world, you knew that it was a good idea to get ahead in doing a piece about vaccines, for example, because eventually a time would come when everybody's talking about vaccines, so it's best to do it as early as possible. So I did a big vaccine piece for The Guardian in April. So quite often ideas suggest themselves to you quite forcefully in that way.
And I saw that you'd written for Caravan. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about your work for them, and then also the role that Caravan played, perhaps people who aren't familiar with it. My understanding, it was a kind of Indian version of the New Yorker, as it were, publishing big narrative pieces. What was that like?
Right. The Caravan is an excellent magazine based in Delhi, and I did my first freelance piece for them in 2011, and it is, as you say, models itself on being a homegrown version of the New Yorker. It has long essays, 3 big reported pieces in every issue, and it was the first magazine of its kind in the country to be able to devote 5 or 6 or even 10. I think the longest piece I did for them was 16,000 words, as many as 16,000 words to a single piece. It had never been done before. And the editors were really strong on narrative journalism. One of them had been at Columbia with me. Another one was somebody who came over, in fact, from the National, an American named Jonathan Shainin, who's now at The Guardian. Jonathan came to Caravan and helped sort of construct its narrative reporting base from scratch. And so it was a really exciting time to be doing that, to be at sort of the forefront of this kind of journalism that had never been done in India before. And it was really how I found my footing. I knew I wanted to do that kind of work, but, I didn't know how to do it. It wasn't just a question of writing 5,000 words, but doing basically 5 1,000-word stories. It's not just like stitching it all together. There's a certain rigor in structure and ideation that has to be instilled in these big pieces, and doing it for Caravan first, I think, helped me quite a bit. uh, helped me to learn a lot of those skills.
And I guess you'd learned a bit of sort of structuring and weaving multiple strands from your book, Following Fish, which was published in India in 2010 and then in the UK in 2012. Could you tell us a little bit about the research process for that, and also how you came to sort of structure it and write it?
It has a very unsexy origin story, which is basically that a publisher back home had read some of my travel pieces in a magazine and came to me to ask if I would be interested in doing a travel book. And so I said yes. And then we came up with this idea. And because I was working at Mint at the time, my idea was always that each chapter would be a standalone piece of narrative journalism, and that they would all be connected by this theme of travel around the coast, but would individually sort of stand alone by themselves as essays. And so I would go out and do a couple of weeks of reporting for each essay and then come back and write on my own time. And that helped as well. I mean, I was doing that in a sense blind. I'd never written a book before. I'd never done that kind of journalism before. I only knew that I wanted to do it. And it's a very strange thing to operate in that kind of mode, because what you're constantly doing is referring to touchstones of great writing that you really admire and that you kind of refer to time and time again, to learn things like structure and tone and voice. And so that book came out in 2010, and really it was sort of, in a sense, kind of minimally edited with, we didn't really do much with it between first draft and final draft. And so it has a lot of flaws, all of them of my own creation. But it was sort of a way to exercise those muscles for the first time and build them up in whatever rudimentary way before I got into caravan journalism, which was really sort of the big leagues as far as India was concerned.
And what was your decision about going freelance? How did that come about? How did you decide that you wanted to work in that way?
Well, I knew I really wanted to do magazine pieces, and I knew I wanted to work long. And this is kind of a cheat because I went freelance while at the same time technically also having this gig at the National, which was, I could not have imagined a more ideal way to go freelance, which is that you also have somebody paying you a monthly paycheck. So, and the work that I did for the National was frequent, but it was not challenging in the way that long form journalism is. And so I could afford to sort of take my time, make some mistakes, fail in pitching time and time again because I was still making rent. But the reason that I wanted to do it was just this, that I knew that I wanted to write in the kind of vein that a lot of the magazine journalists I admire did and continue to do.
And in terms of making connections with editors and approaching new publications, did you have a system for that, or was it sort of blind emails?
Well, I'd worked at the Caravan, and or I'd written for the Caravan, and a couple of editors there were always encouraging enough to put me in touch with other people. But so much of this turns on luck. I think in 2012, in January, I had the great good fortune of being asked to interview David Remnick, the editor of the New Yorker, at a panel in a book festival. We were on two panels, actually. And so in both cases, I was the interviewer. And so I had the chance to spend some time talking to him before and after the events. And he said, I think, in the way that most editors do say if they're encouraging about this, he said, look, if you have anything you want to pitch, you should write to me. So I took him up on his offer. And I happened to be in New York later that year. This was, at the time, this was a trip I would make every summer to go and meet friends, but also very consciously to meet editors as well, because I knew that sort of FaceTime was quite important. And so I would go out and meet people. And so I met him that summer, and I pitched him an idea in person at the New Yorker office, and he said that he would commission it. And so that was, and it all turned on that one piece of good fortune, because once you've been published in the New Yorker, it's very difficult. Becomes much easier rather for you to pitch other places with that behind you. So, but this was definitely one part of my, insofar as I had a strategy, one part of it, which is that I would try to meet people as often as possible. I knew cold emails wouldn't work, or I thought they wouldn't, and and I had the luxury at the time of being able to go to the US for a couple of weeks every summer, where I would do the rounds, which was fantastic.
Could you tell us a bit about the execution of that first New Yorker piece? So, just we'll put it in the show notes, but it's about this anti-corruption politician in India. And perhaps a bit about how you went about negotiating access, but then also what was it like reporting on India as a foreign correspondent, as it were? How did you negotiate that? And then when you've done that in that context and elsewhere, what's the response been like after the stories have been published from Indians?
So access wasn't difficult because at the time this was a small but rising political party and a well-known but otherwise not quite powerful politician. It was his very first election. He was just making the transition from an anti-corruption activist to a politician, and so I wanted to catch him in that cusp and to explore this idea of whether activism has its limits and whether, as he seemed to think at the time, the only way to change the system was to be inside it as a politician. So I thought that was quite interesting, and that was the premise on which I pitched the piece. So access wasn't hard. I had enormous problems with writing and structuring the story, I remember. I did an entire draft, and this was all very harrowing, I have to point out, because for that first piece, Remnick himself was my editor. I cannot tell you what that's like. Knowing that if you fail or if he wants to kill the piece, you will probably never write for the magazine again. So I had my heart in my mouth every time he sent me an email about the piece. And so the first time I sent him a draft, he said, "This doesn't work. You've sort of, you need to start with the guy, the traditional sort of New Yorker structure, which is to start with a man or woman at a particular place on a particular day. Just stick with the template for now. It's your first story." And so I did that, and that's what the final version of the piece looks like. But the thing that I had a lot of problem with, which I'm articulating much better now than I was then, is to sort of move past Kejriwal, the politician, to these deeper layers of these ideas about activism versus politics, the limitations of one, the dangers of the other, and this man who is making his transition from one to the other. And so I had to get coached extensively by David as well as by another editor who I worked with in bringing those ideas to light. And that was it was a huge, intensely learning experience, which I'll sort of never forget. And then once the piece came out, of course, I mean, again, he'd been covered once before at that kind of length, again by Caravan. But I feel like, it is true that when you're a foreign correspondent in your own country, your reporting and your writing can very often seem simplistic to the people living in that country, or basic. But I would argue that there is also another thing that it allows you to, which is to set these stories in the broadest possible context in a way that maybe homegrown publications cannot do. And that context sometimes has value, and to sort of frame Kejriwal's campaign on the broadest canvas of Indian political corruption had a certain merit to it, because it really it gave you both the history and the context of all of it in a way that maybe a smaller, more narrow piece would not be able to do.
And would you say sort of writing about India and Sri Lanka has become a specialism for you? Because obviously the Sri Lankan Civil War was the subject of your next book, published in 2014.
Yeah, I mean, so I think, again, this is a consequence of sort of how magazine journalism works, I guess, which is that if you come from a country and or tend to live in a particular region, people turn to you for those. Initially, at least early in your career, people turn to you for stories from and about that region, and so you become something of a specialist, which many people like, and many people sort of groom themselves to be that. I was always so eager to break free of that kind of bracketing. And just as I wanted to do it in the subjects that I covered, I wanted to similarly do it in sort of the geographical range of my reporting, um, without wandering too far into the realm of parachute journalism, where I would just go from place to place and not have any understanding of local context. And I was eternally sort of, and so I guess, even with my books, I mean, the first book was about and from India. The second book was not from India, although it was from the region. My third book, which has just come out this year, is only tangentially about South Asia at all, or only about South Asia towards the very end of the book, and is really about quite universal ideas on the intersections of science and politics. And so I think that's been quite a conscious progression, at least on my part. Although, you can only plan these things with an enormous amount of luck and hope to succeed.
You sent over also your fascinating New York Times Magazine piece on the backstory of the suicide bomber. What was your process of breaking into the New York Times Magazine like compared to the New Yorker? Was it similar or different? And then tell us a bit about the execution of that story. Execution, sorry, is probably the wrong word. But, how you were able to do the reporting for that.
That came out, the first New York Times Magazine story that I did came about in a very different way, which was that by the time I think my second book was close to completion, another writer, Pankaj Mishra, introduced me to his editor of the New York Times Magazine and said that I should meet her when I'm in New York next. And so I met her and pitched her my first piece a few months later, which came out years ago now. And so I've been writing for her ever since. And this piece came out the same way. And so when the attacks happened on Easter Sunday, 2019, I happened to be living in New York at the time on a year-long fellowship and had lunch with this editor. And she said, because she knew that I'd written this book, is there something you can do about the attacks? And so I went back and thought about what angles intrigued me the most. And I was particularly fascinated by the story of these two brothers who came from enormous wealth and privilege, who had never ostensibly or overtly been radical in their religious views in any way, but had clearly, apparently, turned enough over the last few years to participate in these attacks. And so that was the pitch that I sent her, and to which she agreed. And fortunately, because I'd spent a year in Sri Lanka earlier living there, reporting on the book, I still had a number of people who I knew, and I was able to use those contacts to talk to people about the attack. But again, enormous luck. I mean, luck plays such a huge role. There was one story that's worth telling, which is that I really wanted to get in touch with one of the other members of that family. So these were two brothers who had killed themselves, but they had a number of other brothers, and I wanted to get in touch with the eldest one. And so I tried knocking on his door, and somebody told me through the gate that he wasn't willing to talk to anyone. And then I tried emailing him because I'd gotten his email, and that didn't work. Then I tried talking to one of his friends who agreed to broker an introduction, but that didn't work. And I was at my wit's end. And then this young journalist who I was working with on the story in Sri Lanka suggested that I just write an old-fashioned letter and just slip it under the door of their house. And so I did that. I wrote by hand this huge letter on hotel stationery, introducing myself and talking about the work that I'd done and the fact that I'd lived there before and I wasn't sort of a newcomer to the country, and explaining that he could talk on background if he wished and so on, and slipped it under his door. And then 3 days before I was scheduled to leave the country, he called me and asked me to come over. So really, I mean, these, however well-rooted you think your networks are, and however well-established you think your contacts are, there's still so much that turns on just like last-minute desperation and luck. And this was one of those instances.
Was tone something that you were worried about or thinking about when you were writing that piece? I mean, there's a school of thought on the internet, at least, that pieces about people who've committed acts of violence in some way might give people ideas. Was that something you were thinking about, or did you trust yourself to, get the tone right and not, not run that risk at all?
No, absolutely. I mean, it was something that was on my mind throughout. I think one draft of the piece contained at least two more paragraphs on sort of the merits of writing about people who've committed these acts of violence and the ethical implications of focusing on them to the extent that you devote 8,000 words to their story. We cut those two paragraphs eventually, just because there was, in this particular case, so little known about. Even when I went there late in mid 2019, there was still so much that was just coming out that it seemed almost like a concurrent act of reportage. And so it didn't seem, even when the piece came out a year later, it didn't seem as if it was being done purely to leverage sort of our voyeuristic fascination with people who do this stuff. A lot of the material in the piece was fresh, and it was sort of detailing the ways in which these networks of violence were set up and how they pulled people into them. And that was, I think that has a certain value for everyone. But then, of course, a tone is the other thing, which is that you never want to in any way kind of sympathize with them, but you have to at the same time write about them without overt condemnation leaking out of every sentence. You have to be able to describe their lives in quite a dispassionate way for most of the piece, at least. And so it wasn't the first time I'd done it, because I'd done it before in my book on the Sri Lankan Civil War. I'd done it in coverage of the Mumbai terrorist attacks in 2008. But it's a fresh challenge every time.
I'd like to ask some really kind of geeky and intricate questions about your reporting and editing techniques, if that's okay. So when you're reporting, what is this, and this is probably of limited interest to anyone but who doesn't do this stuff, but of great interest to anyone who does. Do you use, in terms of techniques of note-taking, are you using notebooks or electronic stuff? Are you using automated transcription and things like that? And then secondly, when you're working a piece through, do you file, Rachel is rolling her eyes here, do you aim with an editor to file an initial relatively clean draft, or do you file a rougher plan, or what is your process with an editor with a big magazine piece? Let's really get into the weeds here. So.
Well, I mean, the show is called Always Take Notes. I feel like we'd be disappointing our listeners if we don't get into the geeky stuff. Today, this has changed over the years, obviously, but today I use a combination of electronic recording and notebooks. So the recording is usually only for conversations that I feel will go over an hour, in which case, and for important conversations in which I know that I want to get every last word down, not just the important sentences and the quotes. And then I come back and I transcribe them myself, which takes hours and is a pain in the ass. But I've just never been able to trust transcription services enough. But I also find if you transcribe yourself, you are in a way kind of revisiting the interview in a way that roots the material into your head better. So when you sit down to write, you have a much better sense of what you have. The notebook is for visual details or things that I'm observing or thinking, questions that strike me while I'm interviewing that I have to ask him or her. And also, I mean, if they say things that are particularly interesting in that moment, I will sort of write it down just so I have it in my notes. And those I type up typically at the end of every reporting day. So if I'm out for an entire day, I come back, however tired I am, I just take like half an hour and type my notes out. I take a lot of photos because I find increasingly that for visual details, what a building looks like, what a person's wearing, that kind of thing, it's just easiest to take a photo and then forget about it, and then you can refer to it much later. And trust the photo, because also eventually you'll have to file a lot of this material for fact checking, And so it's always useful to have photos because you can then just upload them onto Google Drive and send them to your fact checker and don't have to worry about, confirming what color the sweater was. And there was one more part to your question, which I'm forgetting now.
With with the editor, so your process in terms of what are you filing initially, going through drafts? How clean do you file rough and then refine it from then, or do you try and be relatively clean from the start?
I'm so anal about this, and I try my best to file a draft that I think will be as close to the final draft as possible.
Okay.
I'm a really slow writer. And the reason for that is that I can't move past a particular sentence until I know that it's roughly in the shape that it will appear in print, which is a terribly inefficient way to go about writing, but it's just something that I can't shake. And so the same applies for drafts. I mean, I find that if I have a draft due on a particular date, I will usually send it in on that date, but I will try my best to make sure that the edits that I get back are as minimal as possible. Which is not to say that no editor ever sends back a draft with no comments or just like, ready for publication, good job, kind of, inscribed on the top. But I try that is sort of the platonic ideal that I wish to hit.
I'm sure editors appreciate that, trying to reach that ideal. I was interested.
It happened once, I have to say. I did a piece for 1843 magazine a couple of months ago about James Anderson, the fast bowler, the English fast bowler. And
I remember reading it, yeah.
I filed that, and I got back 2 comments from my editor. And it was just like, it was the closest I've ever come. And I was so overjoyed. I remember telling my editor that this is what I've been working towards all my career, and you've made this happen.
I'm interested though to kind of push on this a little bit, because my experience from having had, similar to what you outlined with that New York piece of, early in your career you file something at magazine scale, you're asked to do a total rewrite. My feeling is that if you've the effort of getting something, there's a certain amount of like final stuff that needs to be done in terms of putting polish on, checking names, quotes. Like, I don't feel it's worth doing that until the structural thing is rarefied. So what I try and do now, and this is again for me an evolution, has been it's almost the complete opposite actually. I'll initially file just a bullet pointed outline and say, look, I think this is structurally what I'm thinking. What do you think? Can we talk on the phone? And then have a conversation at that stage about structure, then produce a sort of long and loose first draft that is not fact checked, but again is trying to work out those things, the structural piece and the layered principles, so between the human narrative and the bigger thing, then work out what to get it to, and then polish it. But I think rather than the specifics of it, which I think are person by person, broadly what I'm trying to do is set up oneself or one's editor as a team and as a collaboration moving in a common direction towards a common goal. And that I found for me has been very helpful in terms of making those relationships feel collaborative rather than confrontational. But I think clearly if you can deliver something that is like ready to press print on, that's amazing. But my feeling was like the stuff always had to go through 3 drafts, almost whatever I tried to do to start off with. And it was better to like lean into that rather than to not. And the caveat to that would be, I think that is with a big magazine piece. I think if it's for tomorrow's newspaper or whatever, like clearly you want to get it as good and as sharp and as clear as possible. But just really, again, this is really like inside baseball stuff. But
yeah, I mean, my thinking is here that like if I send them a piece where, I feel like the structure has, I've been able to pin down the structure, I've been able to pin down the tone and voice and so on, then the collaboration can really happen at the level of the ideas in the piece, which in my mind are always sort of the most important thing. And that's where a lot of it begins. Of course, that sometimes means tinkering with the structure in some way, but it has almost never meant an entire sort of overhaul of the bones of the piece in the way that it used to, as with my first New Yorker piece, for example. The bones are all largely there. It's just a question of how to drape the flesh on them that tends to change, and that's the subject of the collaborative effort. And a part of this is also because I feel, however collaborative this whole thing is, in the final analysis, you are the one who knows your material best. You're the one who's done the reporting. You're the one who kind of has a gut instinct about what the moving parts of the piece are. And so you're best positioned in a way, at least in my view, best positioned to pin them down in a way that you think works best, and then you can talk about larger ideas which are more abstract in any case, and that underpin the story.
I was struck by something you said about the sort of details, because you sent over a piece that you wrote for Wired in 2017 about the Macedonian sort of fake news generators. And also in your book about Haldane, you talk about a pebble that he sort of carried around that he picked up in Israel. How soon into a process do you pick up on these details? I mean, is it sometimes, presumably, you find something and you think that's going to be a brilliant sort of intro? You know, is some of it, does it come much later? Is it right at the end? You look back over your material and see something in a photograph, or is it sort of a mix of both?
It's usually a mix of both. Although I have to say that when I'm actually reporting, I'm first and foremost always looking for the detail, which is kind of an odd thing to say. But even when I'm interviewing somebody, I'm constantly sort of looking for the telling detail, either in something they say or in something about them. When I'm researching in a book, again, it's always a concrete detail that sticks in my mind, and therefore my logic is that's the thing that will stick in the reader's mind as well. I'm always trying to move, at least in the reporting process, I'm always trying to move as far away from the abstract as possible. And generalities and so on. Discussions of generalities just bore me stiff when I'm doing the reporting. And then when I sit down to write, then it's sort of time to bring abstractions and generalities to the piece or to the book, but that comes out of my own mind in a sense. It's like my thinking and my ideas about the piece. So in a sense, I'm always kind of detail focused right from the get-go. And I'm always kind of trying to see how many cigarettes this guy is smoking in an hour and so on, or the pebble in Haldane's pocket.
I particularly like the in the Wired piece, the fact that they wanted Moet champagne specifically to spray in one of the 3 clubs in the town. Yeah, I thought that was brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, like all of these little things that just, rather than saying that they celebrated their good fortune or whatever, it always helps to sort of contextualize it with actual detail like that.
I remember David Wolf of The Guardian once telling me when I was doing a piece with him about detail, which I'd put in a bunch of stuff, and I was like, great details, David. He's like, no, the detail has to serve a purpose. He was big into that, like, it can't just be, as you say, like that champagne reference talks about it because it's about money and the BMW and that story and things. It's all tied to the sort of motive power of the piece, right, at the same time.
But also kind of like an aspirational thing, right? Which is also that, in the small town in Macedonia, they aspire to party like the global elite. So the cars they buy and the champagne they drink are very much of a particular global vision that they've tapped into clearly in the same way that they're tapping into, American sentiments about elections and presidential campaigns, while they're setting up all these fake news websites. So it's all a part and parcel of that bigger thing. I mean, I found it very funny when I asked this kid about the music that he listens to, and he kind of reeled off these like gangster rap, bands and musicians. Again, another part. So it's almost as if sort of they have one eye forever focused on what the global or American elite, how they live. And so the more champagne feeds into that as well to a certain extent.
Just following from Rachel's question as well, can you tell us about Haldane? He wasn't someone I was familiar with, but reading, the reviews of your book and so forth, it seemed A, that he had a very weird childhood, and B, that he sort of crossed a lot of these strands. As you said, I was reading your HuffPost piece about it, saying, this is about how you should be a scientist in the world. Tell us a bit about him and about how you came to be his biographer.
Well, so I came to him in reverse, so to speak. Haldane, who was a British scientist, moved to India in 1957 and lived there for the last 7 years of his life, became a citizen and died there. And when I learned about that aspect of his life, I was intensely curious because that doesn't happen often. It's usually with scientists, it's usually moving in the other direction from India to the West. And so I wanted to learn a little bit more about him. And frankly, even reading the Wikipedia article about Haldane's life, it's difficult to not be fascinated by it. I mean, the science apart, and science is important and interesting, but the rest of his life is just packed with drama and action. I mean, it's not a static life by any means. This is a man who wrote his first paper in the trenches in the First World War. And this is a man who was suspected of being a spy for the Soviet Union and was spied on by British agencies, intelligence agencies. This is a guy who would experiment on himself throughout his life, completely ran afoul of the establishment at every possible chance, a real character. And so and then I started to read books about him. And at the time that I started work on this, there was only one other biography of Haldane, which had been written decades ago and which didn't, in my view, do a good enough job of linking his science and his politics. And I thought that was an opportunity begging to be explored. And that's how I became his biographer. And I wouldn't have done, I think the appeal to me for this book, and because this is a podcast about geeking out about writing, I think we can talk about this stuff. The appeal was partly in Haldane's character, but partly it was also the challenge to see if I could write a book that read as vividly as sort of reportage, but without having access, obviously, to anything that I'm seeing or anybody that I'm interviewing, drawing exclusively on archival and textual sources to create a really sort of a vivid world and a vivid character. And I was very lucky, or maybe I stumbled into Haldane in a way that helped me, because Haldane's archives are huge, and they're all publicly accessible. And there's been a lot of writing around the times that he lived in as well, which kind of helps you flesh out, for example, what it was like in 1915 in the trenches in France. And so, and then, of course, these two big themes of science and politics, and how Haldane always saw them intersecting and lived according to those intersections, sometimes not always to his advantage, rather. I thought that was sort of enormously relevant for our day, and it has only gotten more relevant since 2016 when I started work on the book.
You talk about wanting to make it as vivid as reportage, but how did you find the experience of writing a biography versus a piece of journalism?
In some ways, quite liberating. I kind of, I thought initially that the inability to rely on people to interview would be constricting. But given the right kind of archival and textual material, it can actually be enormously liberating, because the wealth of these textual sources is so vast that even to read all of them is to feel like you've lived through some part of that story, however briefly. Whereas with reporting, you interview maybe a dozen people for a piece or 24 people for a piece, but very often it can still feel as if you haven't quite understood it from the inside out. That can happen. And maybe this is just a way that conversation in some cases can still be unfulfilling in the way that reading isn't. And maybe it's a way that I process information as well. And so, having read so much about these times and about Haldane and his life, I really felt like I came to inhabit the book and the material in a way that I haven't often felt for narrative journalism pieces. And the other aspect of it also, of course, is that narrative journalism very often is about things that are still unfolding in our time. And so it's often, as with the Sri Lankan suicide bombing story, it's often, you're going out there presenting a fairly incomplete version of events, because there's still so much that is being discovered by intelligence agencies in Sri Lanka, by ISIS specialists around the world, that kind of thing. Whereas with a biography of a man who died in 1964, a lot of there's been so much written and analyzed about that period of time already that you feel you can transcend that and be a little bit more creative, a little bit more idea-driven, if that makes sense.
Very much so. It's a rule of the podcast that we always ask about money and how it interfaces with people's writing lives. To be as frank or as guarded as you will, but in terms of your career, how have you made it work financially, both when you were starting out and now? And now that you work freelance, do you do any other work apart from your magazine work?
Well, as I said, I mean, some of my freelancing career has been something of a cheat because I've had this job with the National. I stopped that. I quit that in 2017, and so for the last 3 years, I've been freelancing only. Again, there are caveats. I was on a fellowship for a year to finish the book. There were book advances, and that always helps. But largely now, I am only a freelancer. I mean, I do a little teaching on the side, but that's it's not much by way of income. It's more just because I think I'd enjoy doing it long term. So how I make it work is to, uh, I think I've done a dozen pieces in 2020. I mean, I haven't counted, but
A dozen magazine features.
I think so. Some of them have been shorter, some of them have been longer, some of them were commissioned last year and then finally published this year, and so I was paid for them this year. But it's basically an endless hustle. It always involves working on a minimum of 3 pieces at once at the same time in various stages of publication, writing, or editing. Um, and it's I'm going to come right out and say it. It's unsustainable. I would, if I had to keep doing this at this pace, I would just burn out in a couple of years. And so I have to clearly find ways to balance it out in a way that I don't do this many pieces. This year was also odd, right? Because the pandemic was raging everywhere, and so in one way you could do pieces a lot quicker because everything was on Zoom. In another way, there was more demand for freelance pieces because everybody was writing about the pandemic, and there's only so many writers to go around. And so I remember there was one extremely funny, at some point in the summer, my editor at Bloomberg Business Week wrote to me to say that they were doing a special issue on vaccines and if I had any ideas. At this point, I was already working on 3 other pieces, but because you're a freelancer, you never turn down the opportunity for a pitch. And so I sent him a couple of ideas thinking that he would say, well, this one works or the other one works. He commissioned both of them for the same issue. So suddenly I was working on 5 pieces at once. And again,
all about vaccines.
No. It was only these 2 about vaccines. The others were like the Jimmy Anderson piece, for example, and a couple of others. And so I didn't turn it down, obviously, and I just said yes and went ahead and did all 5 at the same time, and have just had the last of those come out literally yesterday in Granta. And so it's been a crazy time. This is not something that happens every year, where people are writing to you all the time saying, do you have any original ideas about the coronavirus? But as I said, to go back to my original point, it's not sustainable. Freelancing is intensely hard, and I don't know how people do it long term. It's frightening to think that you have to hustle this hard and work this erratically and in bursts of such intensity for the rest of your life if you want to be a freelancer.
During that period where you had 5 pieces on the go, you said that you're a slow writer, which I'm sure is you being modest, but what kind of hours were you putting in each day to get that done?
My usual work routine is kind of I start work, and this is all the time, not even when I'm writing 5 pieces at once or like working on 5 pieces at once. I start work at 5:30 in the morning and I work till 10, and then I take a break until 2 or 2:30, and then I work again until 6 or 6:30. And this is complicated further by the fact that if you're doing interviews on Zoom and there are people in the US or people in Asia, you have to wake up at weird hours to do calls and Zoom conversations. And so that contributed to a fairly hectic time. And it's at that point, in the summer, we're talking between June and September, it was like 7 days a week, it was nonstop.
But with The Guardian, you have a contracted gig, right? So that's a bit. What's your expected output for them?
That's 4 pieces a year.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how did that relationship with them come about? Did you freelance for them before, or was that on the back of other stuff that you'd done?
Oh, I'd written 1 piece for them when I was still living in India, but then I'd written a bunch after moving out. The long reads was set up by my former editor, The Caravan, Jonathan Shannon, and so I knew him from before. And I think there was a point at which let me think. Sam Knight, who was their contracted writer, then got his job at the New Yorker, so he left the Guardian's long read contract, and at which point they asked if I would be their contracted writer, to which I said yes, because it's a great gig, and I love working with them. And Jonathan is now the opinions editor of the Guardian, in addition to being the long reads editor. But David Wolfe, who I work with more regularly, is now a dear friend, and so I've been doing that now for 3 years, I think.
I think we're coming towards the end of our time. Just one sort of last question. After a well-deserved holiday, what's your next sort of big project?
I'm working on a couple of pieces now. One for Wired magazine about the decades-long quest to get machines to understand human language, and one particular scientist's work on that front, which I think is quite interesting. And then another piece for the Guardian long reads about, well, I don't want to say about what, but it's sort of like let's say it's a parable for Brexit Britain, but with intense sort of local drama. It involves transnational flows of capital, Chinese billionaires. It's quite exciting, and so I'm sort of halfway through that. And these are the only two things on my plate right now. It's a relatively light time.
All the very best of luck with them.
Yeah, Samanth, thank you for being a great guest on Always Take Notes, and we wish you all the best with your formidable workload in the future.
Thank you so much.
Hello, it's us again. That was a great interview, Simon. What did you make of it?
I thought it was very good. I did see you not quite roll your eyes, but almost, as we got into some of the real geekery of, do you...
Not at all. I mean, as you said, that's the point of the show. I think you were a bit harsh there.
Well, maybe unfair, but no, I thought it was really good. I always just try and when we get these very distinguished people on to sort of try and download their brain and find out what all the secret tips and tricks are. So I thought that was really good. Another thing, just we were discussing off air, I thought it was very candid. He's a very successful guy. He writes for some of the biggest publications in the world, but just about quite how grueling his work life is. What hours did he say he was working again? 5:30 to...
It's 5:30 until 6, but obviously took a break in the middle. But even still, makes my 10 till 6 look very cushy.
Yeah, exactly. But he's doing very good work, and I just thought it was really interesting episode. I particularly enjoyed the Wired piece that he sent over, which we'll put in the show notes, with those lads in Macedonia and their crazy club lifestyles. But I think very, very good to talk to him, and I hope he gets some sleep.
Yeah, I hope he takes a break at some point, but sounds like not anytime soon. I would. All the pieces we discussed, I thought were brilliant, so we'll definitely put those in the show notes. I think he was a trove of wisdom, really.
Thank you again, Samanth, for having us on. Anyway, what have you been up to? Well, I know what you've been up to, Rachel. You've been helming the Economist's Booker Prize coverage today.
Yes, well, we're recording this a little bit ahead of schedule. So this week, I and a colleague, Ethan, have divided the shortlist among us and read them all. I think if we'd been more organised, it would have been less time pressured. But as it went, I was doing.
You read them all. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Which if I'd had speed reading skills at university, that would have been much more helpful. But I appear to have developed them afterwards. It's been quite intense. But good. I mean, better that one of my 3 books didn't win, so I didn't have to write the piece, but I did have to edit Ethan's. But yeah, he did a splendid job. And Douglas Stewart seems like a really lovely and talented guy. So I look forward to reading Shuggy Bain, and let's try and get him on the podcast.
Let's definitely try and angle him on the podcast. Yeah, I heard him on the radio this morning, and that was very good. And what's been going on with your course / organised watching of TV?
I've been watching The Undoing, which some listeners may have been watching, with Hugh Grant as a slightly dodgy bloke and Nicole Kidman, written by the same guy that did Big Little Lies, and it's got a very, very similar feel to that. I had a lesson on Monday, which was really interesting. We sort of workshopped a pilot episode of something, which was that I was learning about the differences between sort of US and UK television writing structures. So the writer's room is a big thing in America.
It was a pilot that had been made, like, or you were.
So we used the premise of an existing show, and then we sort of, in little groups, said this is what an inciting incident could be, and this is what a turning point could be, and blah blah blah.
Okay.
But yeah, I didn't realize quite how different the US and the UK system was. I mean, in the UK, you'll have different writers for a series, but each person will sort of go away and write one, and it will come together, and sort of there'll be a story editor or a script developer sort of overseeing it and making sure it's all continuous and stuff. But in the US, it's much more collaborative. The writers' rooms, everyone thrashes it out together. So it's been really interesting learning about that, and I'm looking forward to doing some more reading on it. So yeah, that's what I've been doing. And I also was a bit crafty and wrote about, I have to file something every week, and I wrote about one of the Booker Prize books and how I'd adapt it into a TV series. So 2 in 1.
That is a bit of a busman's holiday. Which system do you think is better, the American or the British one?
I would say probably the American one, and also part of the reason they do that is that you have a mix of junior and senior people, so that the junior people are sort of trained up, and then you have the showrunner who overlooks everything and makes sure it's of the quality that they want it to be. Yeah. But yeah, it's been fascinating. How about you? What have you been working on this week?
I have been closing this big piece for 1843 about contact tracers in Yorkshire. Hopefully, by the time this goes live, it will have been published. It got booted back a week by a long gestating piece on Dominic Cummings that suddenly became very urgent to publish due to world events. So that's been very good. It's like the sort of final close of that, which is it's this weird thing where you're like, you're trying to make sure all the stats are right, and suddenly, but actually what's quite pleasing is it was at that stage that I sort of got a clearer sense of what was working and what wasn't. Suddenly a bunch of things that hadn't been clear fell into place. And the editor sort of seemed happy with it. And I think in that situation, also just about professional practice of just like, just trying to meet the deadlines on time and hitting all of that. And, everyone gets a bit tired and a bit stressed, and just trying to be like kind of professional about it. So that's been good.
You sent us some very professional emails saying that you were working on the piece and that you would get back to us later. If that's any consolation.
Well, I do find I'm big into that kind of email, actually, for having read a book called Getting Things Done, which is exactly what it says in the tin. And it claims that you get stressed, like if you're in a situation like that where you're feeling stressed and overwhelmed, it's much better just to say like, I cannot meet this obligation now, but I will come back to it. And then suddenly it's sort of parked. Elsewhere, my girlfriend got COVID, but she's fine. So I sent her a care package, which has now arrived, so I can disclose its contents. It contained a panettone. So she's a doctor, so she's in a hospital. Not in hospital, but she works in a hospital. So it contained a panettone, a Portuguese cheese, or a Porto cheese, as I refer to it, a set of upmarket Italian coffee, a copy of Random Family by Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc, which she had started but not finished, some printed out circuit training exercises for her to do in her room, and
I like how she's recovering from COVID and
she's not
circuit training.
she's
circuit training exercises.
She's not very ill. I mean, she has very minor symptoms, but she has literally been in COVID jail, as she said it. So that arrived, which is good. And then I've been working actually on this new chapter for a book proposal that I'm putting together, and which hopefully I should get away tonight. So yeah, it's been good. It just kind of I sympathise with Samanth actually on the sort of work thing. I mean, I think what I've been trying to do, and it's sort of coming together, is to actually have a number of things in my work portfolio that are like regular gigs. So I have the day a week I do editing and some other things that are coming together. And the idea is basically that you build enough sort of regularity in your freelance life that you don't have to be constantly hustling. And I think just for one's general, and that, for one's general kind of mental health and state of mind and stuff. And I just think that's an easier way to be, because if you are in that situation where you've got to say yes to everything, you've got to be, I just feel with his thing that he was saying about you have to have a rhythm that's stable, because, you will otherwise just, I felt there's times when I was working on my book and stuff that you will just burn yourself out, and that's not very
100%.
sustainable.
It has to be sustainable.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not easy to get there because exactly, these. I thought interestingly also what he said about the benefits of like going to New York and doing the rounds, which I've done before, but not for a little while, and it's difficult to do now. And I think when I have a number of like elaborate professional relationships with people I've never met, and that's we've sort of done really complicated projects together, and I've never met them, and I always think that's not a fantastic state of affairs. So that was another thing that I
manage quite a big roster of freelancers, and I've met about 5 of them in person.
Yeah.
When they're in London, I try and meet them, but it's not always possible, and it's quite strange when you sort of, especially if they've been on your list for a while and you've done a lot of pieces with them, to not even know what they look like is quite strange.
Yeah. Exactly. I think it is just good to kind of get, which is again what I brought up with Samanth about how these relationships are so important and setting them up that you're all on the same team. That I think is the way. I know a little bit when I was closing this magazine piece, it's like I know that I find at the end of that situation when you're getting in the weeds, it's quite easy to get like slightly obsessional about like this stat, is this marginally correct, or we've called it a sheep field, is it? But there weren't any sheep in the field, so is it a sheep field or a field of sheep? Like you just think at some point, like someone has to say, stop, and and that's helpful. But I find not a straightforward thing to do internally. Anyway, that's probably enough of our
all those 10 minutes of us rabbiting on about ourselves.
Professional exposition.
That person who left us a 1-star review on iTunes because we talked about ourselves too much is
I thought
pretty vindicated right now.
Yeah, we're gonna. That's the London Clean Food Kitchen, isn't it? Our 1-star reviewer. Just so if anyone.
I don't think we need to out them, but
Well, okay.
Here we go.
There we go. I thought their problem was that we were interrupting our interviews by talking about ourselves, and now we've annexed this bit at the end of the show to talk about ourselves, which is, I think, more sustainable.
Yeah, probably better because you can just turn it off at the end.
Exactly. This has been Always Take Notes, hosted by myself, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer is Katie Lee, our graphic design is by James Edgar, and our score is by Jess Danheiser.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Always Take Notes, on Twitter at Take Notes Always, on Patreon at Always Take Notes, and if you'd like to leave ideally more than 1-star review, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.